Yep, looks good.
Okay, perfect. So I'm going to be talking about how to interview, and not just how to interview, but how to select a firm that you want to work at. Because at the end of the day, when you're stepping into an interview, it's really important that you make sure you accept a job at a place where you want to work and where you like the culture and where you like the people. And sometimes it's not possible. Sometimes, you're in a position where you just have to take a job to take a job. But especially, if you are able to and you have multiple offers, you want to be able to be asking the right questions and making sure that you like them too. And that has been a really big shift in the past, I would say about 8 years in recruiting, is the recruiters are a lot more focused on appealing to you and making sure that you're interested in their culture. And Jennifer, welcome. I'm happy that you were able to join us. So I'm gonna do this presentation. You guys already know about me, so we can skip all of that. And let me just get my PowerPoint going. So this first step, of course, is getting your interview. And it's really, really important that you actually are able to get that interview. And there's a lot of things you can do to make yourself stand out. I can tell you that very few people actually follow up after they've submitted an application, and that makes a huge difference. So if you submit your application, it definitely helps to follow up with an email. You can also call the office and ask to speak to the hiring director. If you don't know who's doing the hiring, and they'll just point you to the right person. They might tell you that they're not available, but then you can also just ask if you can get their email address, and then you can send them an email. So definitely after you apply, send a follow-up email letting them know, hey, I submitted my application. I'd like to talk to you about this position further. It sometimes can feel too forward, but from a recruiter's perspective, you're really just making it easier for them. And so it's okay to be confident. It's okay to be forward. They're looking for a great candidate, and you're looking for a great company. And so, there's times where I'm slammed and I'm getting tons of resumes coming in, and somebody calls and I get on the phone with them, and it's like just that connection. It's like, oh yeah, sure, I'll set up an interview, because they've just gotten through to me. And so it definitely does make a difference if you're able to send an email or talk to somebody on the phone. So just some keys for a successful interview. You may or may not even have your interview in an office. So when you come in to do an interview these days, they might never have you see the office until you're actually hired. But if you do go into the office, remember that every single person you encounter is somebody you want to treat with respect, whether it be, the person at the front desk, whether it be, somebody who walks by. Just be sure that you're representing yourself well with every single person that you encounter. Be authentic and positive. So it can be really tempting to try to, be somebody else and be worried that who you are is not going to be the kind of person that they're wanting to hire, but you can't ever keep up an act forever. So it's important that you stay positive and that you're authentic to who you are when you're in the middle of an interview. That doesn't mean that you have to share everything about yourself. You definitely don't have to start talking about, all these personal details or anything like that. But you don't have to, say what you're hoping they want you to say. It's important that you examine yourself and you figure out what your strengths are, and that you're really focusing on those strengths. And then make sure you tie your answers back to your skills and accomplishments. And so as we go through this training, I'm going to help you guys, figure out how to do that. One thing that I'll say is super helpful is any of the personality testing that you've ever done, or Myers-Briggs or anything like that, you can pull those up and it will tell you your strengths. And they're worded in really great ways. It sounds so good the way that it's worded. And so you can read through that, and anything that you really like and you really feel like is a strength of yours, you can jot it down in advance and kind of help that build what your strengths are. So that way, when you're trying to tie things back to your strengths, you already have some pretty good words. That way, you're not going, oh man, I wasn't prepared at all. Because sometimes it's hard to see our own strengths. So these days, there's lots of different kinds of interviews. You might do a one-way interview. And when you're doing a one-way interview, that's when you get a pre-recorded link. It's a link, and you click on the link and you pre-record your interview. And so then the interviewers are going to watch it after the fact. And this is relatively new, but you probably will be getting these from more and more companies where they're like, okay, we want you to do this first. A phone interview. So this could be planned or this could be spontaneous. So you could have a pre-scheduled phone interview, or you could just get a call from the company and they could just start asking you questions and it could turn into a phone interview. Then there's the virtual ones. So that would be through Zoom or Teams or any of these other platforms. And then of course there's the in-person, which is, the most traditional. More and more companies are kind of doing a combination of these, but it's just good to kind of have, an idea of what all the different kinds of interviews there are. So ahead of time, you really want to do your research on the company. It helps to have a couple of key things written down in advance, not so you're reading notes, but just it helps if you write things down, even if you're not holding in front of you, then you have it written down and it will jog your memory later, even if you don't have the piece of paper with you. So it's good to think of a couple of things about the company, which is why you'd like to work there and why you think that they'd be a good fit for you and you'd be a good fit for them. And that way, when they're asking you, what do you know about our company? I know that you do, audits and tax returns and that you're a mid-sized company. I know that you really value, building relationships, That's very simple, but at least it's shown that you've done your research. So it's just important that there's been a little bit of research on your end, because they probably will ask you, why do you want to work for us, or what do you know about us? Practice. The best way to get good at interviewing is just to practice. The more you practice with a family member, a friend, a mentor, the better you're going to get. And when you practice with them, don't just practice the same questions. Practice a variety of different questions, because you can kind of predict what they're going to ask you, but there's such a big question bank of what they could possibly ask that sometimes you're just going to get thrown questions that you didn't expect. So when you're doing the one-way interview, typically what will happen is they'll send you an email that says, we'd like you to do a one-way interview. They'll give you a time frame to complete it by, and there'll be a link for you to click on. And you can complete this usually through your cell phone or through your laptop or a computer. And sometimes they'll tell you in advance what the questions are, and sometimes they won't. So you might know ahead of time what the questions are going to be. In that case, you can read them and you can prepare. But if you're not going to know what the questions are going to be, then you're just going to kind of have to answer them as you read them. Make sure you read the questions really carefully before you actually start recording, that you have a solid internet connection. That way your interview isn't cutting in and out, that you are aware of your lighting, you look at the camera. A couple of things you can do is you can just pull up your camera on your cell phone or on your laptop, and you can see what you look like and what your surroundings look like before you actually start the recording. And that's a really good way of testing it out with Zoom also, because when you do a Zoom interview, you're not going to be in the room ahead of time to get prepared. You're going to get in the room when everyone else is already there. And then you're like adjusting and fidgeting with your lights and moving your screen. And so use the camera on your cell phone or on your laptop in advance to make sure that everything looks good. Make sure you smile. It's super important to smile. It can be difficult when you're talking to keep a smiling face, but just every once in a while, it's okay to just breathe a little. It can feel like, there's a small amount of time and you're not going to be able to get through everything, but you will. You just have to breathe. Meet the deadline. Be sure that you're meeting the deadline, and the best thing is to exceed the deadline. So if they give you until Friday, complete it by Thursday. And then make sure you follow up. Once you complete the interview, send them an email letting them know, thank you so much for the opportunity. I just submitted my video interview. I'm I'm looking forward to hearing from you. Something like that. Because with technology, things can always go wrong. So you might have thought you submitted it, but they might not have it. And so that way, if you tell them that you submitted it, if anything went wrong, they'll be able to email you back right away. Make sure you're dressed for an interview. Obviously it's only going to have, your upper body, but you still want to make sure that, everything's presentable, that your background's presentable. That's super important, for the video interviews. And be aware of your location. So if you're going to do it at home, be aware of animals that might walk in the background, be aware of children, of other people, and try to just keep your location as quiet and free of distractions as possible, because that's going to be the best for you when you're doing the recordings. Sometimes you'll get one take and sometimes you'll get, up to 5 takes. It just depends on how the company set it up in advance. And one thing is, you'd be really surprised to know how many people don't actually complete the interviews, the one-way interviews. So if you do get a chance to do one, don't get discouraged thinking that there's so many other people doing them that you're going to get missed. It's actually the opposite. A lot of people don't complete the video interview, and I think it could be that they think, oh, there must be hundreds of people doing this, I'm never going to get picked. That's not the case. Make sure that you're completing every step of the interview process, unless you're just not interested in the position. If you decide that you're not interested, you can politely let the company know that you're moving forward with somebody else, but be sure to take every single thing you're given as a chance to learn and develop your interviewing and networking skills. For a phone interview, anytime you've applied for a job, just be aware that anytime you answer your phone, it could be a company. And so make sure that, you're answering your phone professionally. Make sure that, if it's not a good time to talk and they kind of start a phone interview, you can ask them, hey, is it okay if we, reschedule this for a different time? Because you don't want to be, say you're at another job and it's really not a good time and you can't step out. You don't want to be awkwardly tripping through their questions. If they've just called you spontaneously, it's okay to let them know, hey, would it be okay if, we had this phone call, in a couple hours? Have your resume handy if it's a scheduled interview. So if you guys have scheduled it in advance, have your resume, because it'll be a good reference for you. And you can also have, bullets of anything you really hope to say in the interview. You don't want to be reading all of it, but it'll be a good reference for you when you're doing the phone interview. If you need a chance to think, it's okay to pause for a moment. It can be hard on the phone to have any dead silence, but pauses are okay. Be ready to take notes. They might schedule a follow-up interview with you, and you'll want to have a piece of paper and pen handy so you can write that down. Have a glass of water. It's good to have something, water or coffee or whatever, in case your throat's getting dry while you're talking. When you get nervous, it can happen where you're getting, stuttering, and so having a glass of water is really helpful. Focus to what the interviewer is saying. Listen and make sure you're enunciating when you're talking. Be sure to let them finish their questions and not to interrupt them. And then have questions ready. There's always, a chance at an interview for you to ask questions. And so it's always good to have some questions ready. And then you want to follow up after the phone interview. So if the phone interview ends and there's no, second interview scheduled or anything like that, make sure you follow up, thank the interviewer, and, ask them what the next steps are. And then for a virtual interview, kind of some of the things I talked about before, you want to test out your camera in advance. You want to pick a good location. You want to make sure that you're dressed for an interview. Make sure your cell phone is silenced or anything else on your computer that'd be making sound. Prepare like you would for an in-person interview. So do research on the company, have a list of questions. All the normal things you would do for in-person, you're going to want to prepare for a virtual interview. Be sure that you have a good Wi-Fi connection. You can test out a Zoom call with a friend in advance just to make sure that the Zoom call is going to be supported on your Wi-Fi. A lot of you guys are already doing Zoom in school, so you probably already have a pretty good Wi-Fi connection. And you probably already know what your computer is able to handle. But in the event that you don't have a good Wi-Fi connection, then you could be sure to go somewhere else where you did have a better one. Make sure that during the interview, you're not distracted, that you're not looking at other things. Don't have their website up and just start reading off their website, because while that might sound like a good idea, it's very quickly going to by your glazed over eyes and what you're saying, they're going to very quickly realize, oh, they're just reading my website right now. So it's better to have done all of that in advance. Be sure to thank the interviewers for their time and then follow up. You can follow up with an email or a handwritten note. I would say that if you do a note, be sure that you deliver it. That way they're actually receiving it, because if you mail it, they're not going to get it for several days. And then for in-person interviews, you want to know how to get to where you're going, plan for traffic and arrive 10 to 15 minutes early, because there's nothing worse than running late for an interview, getting lost, running in, out of breath, very stressed out, and then you're going straight into an interview. You start off on the wrong foot. And so arriving early will give you a chance to breathe, sit in the waiting room, and have a chance to compose yourself before your interview starts. In these days, make sure you bring your mask, obviously, because, you're not going to be able to get in the building without your mask. Bring copies of your resume. And if you can find out in advance how many people you'll be interviewing with, that way you can have copies for every person. And it is good if you're able to get it printed on nicer paper. But if you can't, it's fine to just, bring it on regular paper. But make sure you bring copies of your resume to pass around, and make sure that your resume is up to date. And so even if the resume you submitted was outdated, you can bring a new, more up-to-date resume, and that's fine. Make small talk with the receptionist, and be sure to treat everybody respectfully. Anybody walking through the office is somebody who could later have an input on whether or not you get the job. And the receptionist, how the receptionist is treated by the person coming in to be interviewed, it really says a lot. A company is not going to hire somebody that, ignored the receptionist. Some will, but that might not be a company that you want to work for. If they offer you water or coffee, go ahead and accept it. It can be really natural to not want to let somebody do you a favor, but people like doing favors. So if somebody offers you coffee or water, it's really good to accept it. They'll feel good, and they'll have good feelings towards you because they did you a small favor. And sometimes it can be a tendency to think, oh, I don't want to accept that because I don't want to be a burden. It's just a drink. It's not a burden. Sit up straight during the interview, make eye contact, and don't speak negatively about prior employers. There might be negative things that have happened, and those experiences might come up, but you want to be so careful about the way you speak about prior employers, because that's not going to make you look, like an employee that they would want to hire. And then at the end, be sure to thank the interviewers, and then you also want to follow up with a personal email to each person who interviewed you. So you can ask them for business cards, and they'll provide those to you, and then you'll be able to send them each interview emails. Same with the handwritten note. You can, drop off a handwritten note, but if you're going to do a note, make sure you bring it in the same day or the next day. And with the email, you want to send the email the same day. So in an interview, you're going to be asked a lot of different questions. And the best way to answer the questions is to give an example. So if somebody says, are you an organized person? You would want to say, yes, I'm an organized person. And then you'd want to give an example of how you're an organized person. An example maybe in school or in a prior job where you organize something, or you've used your organizational skills. If you're not an organized person and they ask you, then you could say, that's something I struggle with, but I'm doing this and this and this to improve my skills in organization. And so the STAR method can be very helpful when you're answering questions. With the STAR method, you're asked a question and you tell a situation that has to do with the question you were asked. And then you talk about what the task was. So maybe you go, okay, in a job that I was at, I was assigned the task of organizing the file room. And then you're going to say your action. So you'd say, so I went about organizing the file room by doing this, this and this. And then you would say your result. So, and the result was we were able to find files quicker. It was more organized for everybody else. And my supervisor was very pleased with what I did. And so now you're, instead of just answering the question very basically, you're taking something that they've asked you and you're breaking it into 4 pieces to tell a story and give them an example of what you've done. So that's really important when you're being asked questions that you're able to draw it back to personal experience, because people can say all day long that they can do something, but if you can share an experience of how you've done it, then you're really able to have them remember you, and you're able to like show them an example of, you know, how you approach problems, how you solve things, and how you're going to be in the workplace. So some common interview questions. It's very common that they'll ask you to tell, you know, about yourself. And this is probably going to be asked in every interview at the very beginning of the interview. And it's super, super important that you are well prepared for this question. And so a way that you can prepare yourself for this question is ahead of time, come up with a short little pitch of, you know, who you are, you know, what your values are, what that looks like in the workplace, and then just a little bit of something personal. So you could say something like, you know, I'm Hannah. I'm very passionate about cultivating relationships and culture in the workplace. And I do this through, you know, day-to-day interactions with people. And I also in my personal life really enjoy hiking. And so that would be more for like a human resources, right, type, you know, position. But, you know, for accounting, then you could talk about something like, you know, I'm Ryan. I'm a very determined person. I have a very good work ethic. And in the workplace, I always strive to make everything I touch a little bit better than when it started. And I really enjoy, you know, playing video games or baseball or, you know, whatever it is. And so you can see that like now you've given yourself a really short sales pitch where you've given them not just an idea of who you are personally, but who you are professionally. Next, they're going to ask you, they might ask you what your hobbies are outside of work. And so now you just share your hobbies, you know, maybe you like playing video games, or maybe you know, coach a, you know, football team for kids, or maybe you enjoy volunteering, or maybe you love making meals with, you know, your partner. It's, you know, whatever you enjoy doing, go ahead and share that, but try to expand on it a little bit. So instead of, oh, I like to watch movies, maybe you like to watch old movies, or maybe you like to, you know, binge watch TV shows on Netflix that are about, you know, murder mystery. It helps to have a little bit more about you than just the hobby itself. So maybe you like painting with acrylics, and that's going to give people a way to connect with you and remember you. Then they might ask you why you applied for this position. And so at this point, you would have wanted to have looked at the website in advance, really read the job description, being able to say, I applied for this position because I really think that I would bring this and this to this company. And, you know, reading your values, reading your website, I, you know, really like what you stand for. This seems like a really great culture. And that's what drew me to this position. So again, when you're talking, you're pulling it back into what you already know and showing them that you've really done your research and that you've really prepared and that you'd be a good fit for the company and for the position and that they'd be a good fit for you. Then they're going to probably ask you what are your strengths and your weaknesses. So for strengths, we talked about that a little bit before. Like I said, if you're really struggling coming up with your strengths, it helps in advance to, you know, read some results of your personality test, jot down what you think, you know, are the best ones, and you only need 3 to 4. You don't need to come up with a huge long list of everything, but give examples. So you might say, I'm a very determined person, and, you know, in the past I had to, you know, do this and this, you know, I was in a job where somebody quit, and so I had to take on some additional responsibility, but it really gave me a chance to learn some new things, and I used my determination to get through that time where we didn't have as many people in the office. And so you're not just sharing, you know, I'm loyal, I'm dedicated, I'm a hard worker, but you're actually breaking each strength down into what that looks like and how you've used that in the past or how you use that in the present. And then for your weaknesses, when you're talking about your weaknesses, you really only need to list 1 or 2. And it's important that you've planned this out in advance, and that when you share a weakness, you share how you're, you know, responding to the weakness. So a weakness could be something like, I have a tendency to say yes to everybody, but I'm learning that when someone asks me to do something, I first need to find out the priority and when the deadline is. That way I can be sure that I fit it into my work schedule and that I let them know an accurate timeline for when I can get it done. And that way I'm not disappointing anybody. And so you've accurately shown, here's a weakness, here's what I'm doing about it, and here is how it affects the workplace, and what I'm doing about it, instead of just, oh, I work too hard, you don't or I'm too hard on myself. It's good to think about your weaknesses and come up with something that you can share that's going to be relevant, and that people are going to connect to, and that's going to show that you're self-aware. But you also don't want to come up with the worst thing you've ever done and your biggest mistake ever and share that either. It's a good balance between a weakness, but without saying something that's just going to sink you and that they're not going to be able to let go of. So a weakness rather than a situation, if that makes sense. So like sharing like this is the exact thing that happened, this is how it affected anybody and it was terrible, probably isn't the best way to go, because depending on the interviewer, they could really latch onto that. But if you share instead something like an area of weakness and what you're doing to address it, that's going to be better received. Then we have proudest accomplishments. Make sure that your proudest accomplishments are related to either work or school, rather than them being personal accomplishments, unless there's a way that that personal accomplishment relates back to work or school. And then where do you see yourself in 5 years? This can be a really difficult one when you're still figuring things out, but try to think of it in the context of the career and the context of the firm. And then again, just, you'll probably get asked this one, so just kind of have it planned out in advance. So you don't need to have it perfectly planned out, but, in 5 years, I would really hope to get my CPA license and to be a manager in a firm where I really love the culture. Something like that is fine. You don't have to come up with some crazy goal, like, oh, I want to own my own company by then. It's okay to have, realistic goals. You don't need to come up with the most ambitious thing and say it because you're hoping that's what they want to hear. You want to, again, tell them what is true and what is true in relation to the, position and to the field. And then, the interviewer will say, do you have any questions for me? And I would say that even if they don't ask if you have any questions, if they, wrap up the interview, I would ask them, like, is it okay if I ask you some questions? Because it's really good for you to get a chance to ask those questions, because again, you're also looking for a good company and you're looking for somewhere where you'd be a good fit. But majority of interviewers will give you a chance at the very end to ask some questions. And so you just have to come up with, a couple in advance. You don't need to have a long list of questions. I would say 2 or 3 is plenty. And I wouldn't ask, more than 3 questions, because then it could just drag things out really long. And these you can write down in advance and keep them on you. So it's okay to say, yes, I've prepared some questions, and to pull out your piece of paper. If you know that you'll remember them, then that's fine. But it is better to, even if you have to keep the piece of paper with you as a security that you can go back to if you need to, then you'll at least have it. A couple good examples of questions are, how would you describe the characteristics of someone who would be successful in this role? This next one is a little bit, bold to ask, but it is very, well received, and it gives you a chance to hear if they have any doubts and to address those. And that's why this next question is a good one. So after talking to me and interviewing me, is there anything that would make you hesitant to hire me? So now if they say, I'm a little hesitant because of your lack of experience in this area, then you have an opportunity to respond to that. And so that's why this is a good question, because if there's anything they're unsure about, you'll still get a chance before the interview's over to respond back to that. Another one is, if I were in this position, how would my progress be measured? And what are the next steps? They might tell you in advance. Sometimes at the end of the interview, they'll tell you the next steps are, this. But if not, you can always ask that. And there's a lot more questions that you can ask. These are just some ones that are, you want to ask smart questions. You want to ask questions that like show the interview that you are, thinking this through, and then you're not just, I don't know, and throwing a question out there. So you want to be prepared. And then after the interview, like I said before, send them email, or you can send them a note thanking them for interviewing you. It is good to send one to each person who interviewed you. And then in the email, you thank them. You can restate why you would like the position, and you can restate why you feel like you'd be a good fit for the position. So you could say, thank you so much for taking the time to interview me today. After meeting you and the team, I'm, very serious about this position. I think that I would bring this, and this, to this job. And I'm, really looking forward to hearing back from you. Just something like, you don't have to send them a novel, just a couple sentences, thanking them, restating, and, letting them know that you are, very interested in the position is a good way to tie up that email. Some big interview mistakes. Not dressing for an interview, showing up, dressed, in jeans. Even in our office, we're, pretty casual. We have, we wear jeans when we're in the office. But, when we're doing an interview, we'll still dress professionally. And it's good when you go to, an interview that you're also dressed professionally, even if you know that it's a more casual office. Being late, obviously you don't want to be late, but if something happens and you're going to be late, be sure to call. So say there's an accident that couldn't have been predicted, you'll just want to make sure to call and let them know, I'm so sorry, I am running late. Using your phone, obviously you don't want to be checking your phone or texting or anything like that during the interview. Not knowing anything about the company or the job, is another big mistake. You don't want to come in and be totally unsure of, the company that you are interviewing with and what the position's like. Having an outdated resume. It's a little awkward when you're doing an interview and you keep saying, oh, well, that should be on there. Oh, this one's outdated. You want to be sure that you have an updated resume that they're looking at. Not paying attention. Be sure you're not zoning out and losing focus, that you're, listening to what the interviewer is saying. Talking too much and oversharing personal information. Now, talking too much, that's, because when you're doing an interview, the interviewer should be talking 30% of the time and you should be talking the rest. Some interviewers will talk a lot, and there's not a lot you can do about that. But really, when I say talking too much, I mean when they ask you a question and you go on and on and on and on and don't know when to stop yourself. So every answer should have an end. You don't want to just keep going on and on or feeling the need at the end to just keep asking more and more questions. And then oversharing. It's somebody in an interview one time, I asked them what their proudest accomplishment was, and they said it was when they divorced their husband, who was homeless when she met him. I was like, oh, okay. So again, that's it's not the time to share about your addiction past or about your family issues, or, you don't have the position yet. And this is a professional environment, so you don't want to overshare. So there's a way to be personable and be relatable and show a bit of your personality while still being a professional. And then, like we said before, bad-mouthing past employers and past team members. If you're doing that in an interview, they're going to go, well, what do they like to work with? It's okay. So we hear people, they come in sometimes and they, we ask them about something. It's very obvious from the way they answer that their past employer was a crazy person. So you don't have to lie and say they were amazing. If you're asked a direct question, it's just, what are you doing with that? Are you just being factual of this is what happened, or are you bad-mouthing them? And so remembering that you don't need to pretend that they were the greatest ray of sunshine, the most amazing person ever, but the interview is about you and how you respond to things and how you work with people, not about the past people that you worked with. And then last one, salary expectations. This can be really uncomfortable when they ask you, what are your salary expectations? One thing is in California, employers are no longer allowed to ask you, what are you making at your current job, or what have you made at your past jobs? So just so you know, if they say like, what are you currently making? That's actually not something that they can ask you, but it's something that they used to be able to ask you. So you don't have to answer that question. It gets a little awkward if someone asks you something that's actually not legal for them to ask you. And so if they did ask you, what are you currently making? You could just say, well, what I'd like to be making is this. This is, what based on the research I've done, this is what's appropriate, for this position. And so that way you're not really confronting them. You're more just kind of answering their question in a different way. But ahead of time, you can go on Glassdoor and you can go on Indeed salaries and do a little bit of research. If you have friends who already have accounting jobs who will tell you what they're making, that's also very helpful. Starting off in an accounting firm, everybody has, a different, salary range, a different thing that they pay their associates, different thing that they pay their interns. And so going on Glassdoor can be really helpful to get some of that data. But if they ask you, what is your salary expectation, it's okay to say that you want to know more about the job requirements first. And so if you're not prepared to give them a number, you can put them on hold and say, I'd really like to know more about the job requirements. I'd like to know more about some of the other forms of compensation and benefits that you offer. But if you do have a number, it's always good to give a range. And so don't just give a hard number, give them a range of, what you're looking to make. And again, it helps to say, I've done some research and this is the range, that is acceptable for this position based on the, research that I've done. So then if they disagree, they're able to kind of respond with, well, actually, this is, more of like an appropriate range for this position. You can also just say, well, I'd like to know what the range is for this position. And so the salary negotiation is always what can be hard, especially when you want a job so bad and you're not prepared. I remember years ago when I got this job, I didn't think I would get asked that at all. So I was on the phone with Pete and he's like, how much do you want to make? I'm like, I just threw out a random number. And so that's fine. But had I been more prepared, then I would have been able to kind of sound a little bit more confident and a little bit more well prepared when I was answering the question rather than just going, And that's it. We have just 5 minutes for any questions. I know that was a lot of information.
Do you prefer more conversational interviews as opposed to stiffer sort of like standard question styles?
I like a mixture of both. So, when we do interviews, we have a set of questions, but we'll bounce off those questions. So like if we're like asking a question, that question could lead to different questions. So that's the kind of interview that I like to do. I like to do where you are going like a middle between like very traditional and very conversational.
Thank you.
I had a question. What kind of response would you give for for lack of experience if you were to ask the question about why are you hesitant to hire me?
So sorry, can you restate the question?
So my question was, how would you respond to for a lack of experience?
So if someone asked me like why, if there's anything that would make me hesitant to hire them, and my answer was lack of experience, like what would I say?
Yeah.
I mean, I got asked this question recently, and the person who asked it, my answer to them was that it's really difficult when we're doing interviews, with new team members who don't have any experience, because sometimes it's hard to know, are they looking for a firm to settle in and be there long term? Or are they looking for somewhere to be at a year and get their hours? And so I said, it's always a little bit hard because we're looking for somebody who's going to be here long term, even if it's at least just 3 to 5 years. But if you're only going to be here for a year, get your hours and go somewhere else, then we've lost out on all the training. So lack of experience isn't usually a reason we wouldn't hire an associate, because everyone we're getting doesn't really have experience. Some people might have had an internship before or might have some QuickBooks experience. But, we don't expect, new associates to really have that experience. But what we're looking for is some sort of job experience. Even if someone's worked at McDonald's or Subway all through college, it's okay, because it shows that they have good work ethic and that they have a job. So the best thing you can do if you're worried about lack of experience is to just get any kind of experience. And that way you can show on your resume, like, I have had a job and I have stayed there. Once you get, obviously, like once we're, looking to hire somebody like a senior associate, obviously, like then experience really matters. We're not going to hire somebody at a senior level unless they worked at a firm for, at least a year. They would have to have relevant experience. And even then, typically 2 years to 3 years is before, you're a senior associate, unless you're really amazing. But we have hired people before with only a year of experience and then promoted them after a year to senior associate. Any other questions?
One of the questions I like to ask the interviewers, like at the end, is like, what are some common flaws you see in interns or newly hired employees? And the answer is usually pretty much the same, but would you say that's a good question though, to like ask?
Yeah, it's a good question. It shows that you're trying to find out the things that they don't want to see happening, and that like you're already kind of looking to improve before you even got the position. So yeah, that's a good question.
I had a question. They used to always say that you were supposed to like mirror the interviewer. Would you say that's still true?
Yeah, they're probably saying that because whenever you're mirroring somebody else, you're matching their voice tone, their voice speed, some of their hand motions. It does tend to make people like you better. That's just psychology. So yeah, that's not a bad, tactic, as long as it's not too over the top. It can, it can get to a point where it's like way too, much. But I would say that, the interviewers will be, they'll sit up straight and they'll be, engaged and stuff. But say you had a weird interview experience and the person who was interviewing you wasn't, and they were a lot more relaxed and a lot more casual, leaned back in their chair, I wouldn't copy that, and so I would say that, yes, mirroring them is a good thing, just not to exaggerate it too much to where it might seem like mocking.